Hello, beautiful people, and welcome, to the 4.7 meta roundup. I've seen a lot of people say that they've struggled a lot with this abyss. I think this is probably the hardest abyss we've ever had. It's a bit less about bosses stalling and a bit more about mixing DPS checks with application checks with elemental shields. And so, I know this meta roundup is a little bit more anticipated than the average one, so let's get right into it. First off, let's very quickly get floor 11 out of the way. I know a lot of people are struggling with target defense. The best advice I can give you is focus the pyro slimes and focus the cryo slimes. Use groupers if you have them. Give it 1 or 2 shots and you'll be fine. So, let's go through what we have in Chamber 1. First, we have 3 primal constructs. Then, on the other side of the abyss, a Ruin Guard spawns. Then, in the other corner, 2 Ruin Drakes spawn. And then, on the 4th wave, 2 Eremites spawn. Again, on the other side of the abyss. Then, on the second half, you have 2 Pyro Abyss Mages with a Dendrosometro, followed by 2 Abyss Lectors, followed by 2 Black Serpent Knight Windcutters that spawn on the other side of the map. Chamber 2, you have Magu Kenki. Then on the other side, you have 2 Kaidagis, followed by 2 Humanoid Mechs, followed by 2 Rift Hounds, followed by the Construction Specialist, the Arithmetic Enhancer, and the other one of these 2 guys. That's again 4 waves. And then finally, Chamber 3, you have Simon on the first side, and then on the second side, you have 1 Pyro Agent accompanied by 2 Pyro Skirmishers. Then you have the Red Vulture Consecrated Beast with 2 Seahorses. And then you have the Scorpion Consecrated Beast with 2 Crabs. With 3 waves. You can tell they were threatened by Wuthering Waves' release with the amount of waves they've put in this abyss, because Jesus Christ. Anyways, overall, Chamber 3 is kind of a pushover compared to the other 2. It sounds scary, but Consecrated Beasts aren't actually that dangerous. What's made them so dangerous in abysses in the past is that you had 2 at the same time. And the reality is just that the Seahorses and the Crabs are not nearly as scary as a Consecrated Beast, and so as long as you're paying attention, you should be fine on this chamber. Also, the DPS check on this is a lot less bad than the other chambers, because stuff spawns together, and it just feels a lot nicer. Chamber 2 is, compared to Chamber 1, also kind of easy, but it is definitely still a chamber that some people can struggle with, because Chamber 1 is very much an elemental check. Now, what that means is it's going to warp your teams. You're going to have to build your teams around Chamber 1. And if you want to do it all without having to swap your teams, that means you're going to have a team that's built around the elemental checks in Chamber 1 that's going to need to deal with a 4-wave DPS check in Chamber 2. Chamber 1 is harder, but because it's harder, you have to build for it, and if you're building for it, Chamber 2 can become harder because you're not built for it. And so Chamber 2 can still be a bit of a challenge, but really the biggest challenge in this abyss is Chamber 1. So the main reason why it's so challenging is because, 1, your elemental check isn't just an elemental check. It's accompanied by a DPS check, because it's not just a wave of shitters into 2 lectors. It's a wave of shitters into 2 lectors into another wave of relatively tanky enemies. But honestly, the real reason why Chamber 1 is so rough is because of the first half. Having something like this, if the first half was tanky, would be completely fine. What makes this so rough is that a lot of people don't have teams that are strong enough in multi-wave content that they can get through their first half of Chamber 1 with the minute 40, minute 50 plus that you would like to be able to do this comfortably. What that means is, effectively, the way that you're going to want to build your teams is your first side team has to be a team that does well in multi-wave content. It has to be something that doesn't just lose all of its damage in multi-wave, right? You can't easily get away with playing something like Sino with Nahida as your only Dendro, because you're gonna have to swap out a Sino after you kill the first wave, and then again after you kill the second wave, etc. If that's what you do, and you end up with, at the very least, 20-second rotations, assuming you play perfectly and there's no running between enemies between your rotations whatsoever, which just isn't gonna happen, that's at minimum 80 seconds, which leaves you with 140, which I would say is like the bare minimum for a decent team to be able to clear. There are teams that can clear faster than that, and we'll get into that, don't worry. But I definitely do think that, like, if your first half is clearing with like a minute 30 remaining, you're a lot more likely to struggle. Anyways, so you build your first team around something that's very strong in multi-wave, and you build your second team around being able to destroy these elemental shields as quickly as possible. And honestly, there is actually so much time that is spent breaking shields in this chamber that it generally is worth sacrificing a decent amount of DPS just to get better shield breaking. Now, that can hurt you in future chambers, which is why, like I said earlier, Chamber 2 can potentially, for some lineups, be the most difficult of the 3 chambers. But worst case scenario, you can just change your teams back to the traditional DPS teams you usually play once you've gotten 3 stars on Chamber 1. So, what sort of teams do really well against this chamber? So, the way that Pyro Shields work is if you apply Animo or Geo to them, it removes 0.5 units of Pyro. If you apply Cryo to them, it also removes 0.5. If you apply Electro, it removes 1. And if you apply Hydro, it removes 2. That means your best bet is generally going to be Hydro units. However, some of the Electro units, which are the second best element at dealing with this, have Electro application that is so good that even with less shield removed per application, they're still very strong options for shield breaking. Mainly, that's Beidou and Fischl. Beidou's burst initial hit being 4 units of Electro, her skill being 2 units every time you use it, and her ult, when it bounces between the two, effectively applying Electro on each time that it, gets the 5 bounces, right? Like, you'll apply Electro to both Lectors per ult proc, right? Like, once on each with your 5 bounces. And then Fischl, who, if you are on-fielding any Electro unit, Beidou included, adding another unit of Electro every time you already apply some Electro, and also just being a lot easier to slot into teams at a baseline. Those units make things a lot easier here. Now, does that mean you have to use them? No, far from it. But I do want you guys to keep that in mind, because a lot of the units that are good at applying Hydro on this chamber are 5-star units that you might not have. And so the fact that Beidou and Fischl are so good at it is very, very relevant. So outside of Beidou and Fischl, who else is good at shield breaking here? I think that the best unit for shield breaking, only for shield breaking this chamber, is most likely Kokomi. Her skill can very easily hit both the Abyss Mages and to both of the Lectors. It also has 100% uptime and can be used at the start of your rotation without, you don't need to set it up because it's not the part of her kit that does damage. And then on top of that, once you get to the shield breaking phase, you can start using her charge attacks that apply Hydro with no ICD and AoE. Other than that, we have Farina. She's got decent application that is mostly single target, but somewhat AoE. Her biggest upside is that application is not reliant on you doing anything specific. So if you're struggling to not die against the Lectors, you can focus a lot more on dodging if your source of Hydro is Farina than if it's someone else. Child, who has very, very good Hydro application, and who would be better than Kokomi at that application if the Lectors were the third wave instead of the second wave. However, the fact that it's the second wave means that you still need to do another rotation with Child after you kill the Lectors. And in previous Abysses, Lectors have always been on the last wave, which made it so you can just stay on Child, use his E, and stay on him until the Lectors are dead, until the shields are broken. Unfortunately, if you do that now, it's going to put his E on a pretty long cooldown, and you're going to effectively be playing a 3-unit team for your last wave. Which sucks because it's an AoE wave where his AoE Hydro application and damage would matter a lot. If you're at high enough investment, you can probably get away with still doing it and just using Channeling Burst plus 1 Child Burst to try to nuke the last wave. But that is definitely something to keep in mind. Other units that have good Hydro app for this, Ayato. Ayato actually has very good Hydro application for this chamber. He's overall somewhat similar to Kokomi, but it's burst reliant, so you need to make sure you're getting your energy batteried properly, which is a little bit more difficult than with Kokomi, whose Hydro application is a lot less reliant on her burst. To some extent, Candace, it's fine. Now, you'll notice I haven't mentioned Xingqiu and Yelan. And the main reason for that is because while their application is good, it is also single target. And there's always 2 shields to break. In the first wave with 2 Pyro Abyss Mages, and in the second wave with 2 Lectors. Now they're still good at breaking the shields, but if you're playing either of them as your solo Hydro unit, it is going to feel like it's not enough. Your shield breaking is going to take more than 30-ish seconds, and that's just, for most people, going to make it so you just don't have enough time for the rest of the chamber. If you play them together, you'll still generally be fine, but the rest of your team needs to be strong enough to pull their weight for the DPS check in the last wave pretty well. Now, I haven't mentioned Neuvillette and I haven't mentioned Nilo yet, and it's not because they're bad at it. It's because, honestly, Neuvillette needs to be mentioned as a standalone. This Abyss is definitely a consequence of Neuvillette's release. Like, they made his damage high enough that paired with his utility, the fact that he can consolidate his AoE incredibly easily and that he's really easy to play, if you don't make the Abyss harder, Neuvillette like completely trivializes it. And I think that's why this Abyss is such a jump in difficulty. It's because of Neuvillette. Now, obviously, in this Abyss, he does very well. He's a great carry for multi-wave content, which means he's great on first half, and he's a Hydro unit with decent AoE Hydro application that can be played with Farina, who also has decent Hydro application, which makes him also pretty strong on the second half. And then finally, Nilo, who doesn't have great Hydro application herself, but who is always played with another unit that has, at the very least, good Hydro application. And obviously, this is a very, very good Abyss for Nilo. It's not necessarily what I generally call a Nilo Abyss, because it's not really about an AoE DPS check, but it is just as good for Nilo as a Nilo Abyss. But yeah, so this is an amazing Abyss for Nilo, so don't be surprised if you see a Nilo rerun in the near future, let's just say. Other than that, what are the other teams where you can use those strong units? So Mono Hydro does pretty well, although I will say I was kind of surprised at how it felt without Kokomi. Mainly because without a grouper, it does feel worse. And if you're playing Mono Hydro with Farina, it's hard to fit in a grouper and a healer, unless your healer is Kokomi. That's not to say that Mono Hydro can't clear without Kokomi. It's like you can very much still just do like Ayato as your own fielder and just ditch the Farina altogether. Or even not ditch the Farina and just do it without grouping, but it's going to be a bit more difficult to do. And then obviously, Kokomi just has the best shield breaking for this one. But yeah, I would say if you don't have Kokomi, you're probably better off turning your Mono Hydro team into a Taser team. Taser team is incredibly good this Abyss. The elemental check is a bigger deal than the DPS check, and a lot of the upside with Taser, which is incredible elemental application, great stagger, great utility. This is the sort of stuff that doesn't necessarily directly translate to DPS checks, which is why Taser teams haven't been as popular lately. But whenever you have an Abyss like this one, Taser comes back in full force as a great option. When I was doing my clears with 4-star only units, I started off trying to do Aggravate first side and National second side, which is what I've generally been doing lately. But the application from Singto alone just felt lackluster, and so I had a much easier time doing Reverse Melt on the first half and Taser on the second half. Other than Taser, we have Hyper Bloom, still obviously very strong in this Abyss. Tends to be a team that does well in multi-wave content. Now, Chamber 1 is a little bit of AoE, so if you're playing a more single target focused Hyper Bloom team, it'll be a little bit slower than the better AoE teams that are also good in multi-wave, like Neuvillette, but it will not be that far behind. And obviously, as a low investment option, it's always amazing. It's also playable in the second half if you're playing the double Hydro version of Hyper Bloom. I would not recommend it if you're playing only one Hydro. I think it's a bit too rough on the elemental check, but it is still somewhat doable if you're doing like one Hydro with Kuki Fischl. You can use Kuki plus Fischl application as a decent way to get through your shields. Other than that, Freeze is okay in this Abyss, but again, right, Cryo being not very effective at dealing with Pyro shields means that your Freeze teams are going to need to have a strong Hydro applier as a last slot. Farina is going to struggle a lot as solo Hydro in those teams, so if you have a Kokomi, you can use that. That's going to be great. Otherwise, honestly, I'd try to lean towards double Hydro versions of Freeze rather than solo Hydro. But yeah, so let's get into some gameplay, and let's go through each chamber, go through some tips to make them easier. First wave spawns in the north, second wave spawns in the south, then third wave spawns in the west, and then last wave spawns in the east. It's north, south, west, east. So you can already start like pathing a little bit towards where you know it's gonna be, especially if you're against enemies that actually move a little bit. First wave is very straightforward. It's just 3 Doritos. If you have a way to group them, that can help. If you don't, just kill them one at a time. They're not that tanky. They shouldn't be too much of an issue. If you have a ranged character like Niviet, you can obviously start pathing towards your next wave on the south. And then again here, right, if you can also start kiting towards the spawn of the next wave. The west. And then finally, you can again start pathing towards the last wave in the east.
Where do you think you're going?
Okay, if you path when you kill the Doritos, if you start running instantly towards the Rune Guard, he won't do the rockets attack. But if you take a little bit too long, he will. So let me show that. Right? He's gonna do his rocket attack, which obviously if you get melee range is a lot harder to dodge, so that can be something to keep in mind. When it comes to the Earth Drakes, they waddle away from you very often. And so if you stay in the middle between them, generally what you're gonna end up with is them, again, waddling away from each other like this. And so you're generally better off trying to position yourself so that just barely you're on the outside of them. Alright, so if I stay on the outside here, they generally mostly stay relatively close together. Obviously, it's not a perfect science because their movement patterns still have a lot of RNG in them. Sometimes they waddle backwards, sometimes they waddle forward. But as you can see, right, we keep them grouped a little bit better by staying on the outside. And then finally, on the last wave, you want to target the wind one first. Because, one, the Scorpion goes towards you a lot more often than the bird, which means you're a lot more likely to kill the Scorpion earlier. And two, after a little bit, the Pyro Lady dashes towards you, and the Animal Lady dashes away from you. Ideally, you want to try to kill their summons first, because once you kill their summons, it deals some percentage current HP to them, which means if you kill them very late, it will not do a lot of damage, but if you kill them before you deal any damage to them, it's going to do a lot, and then finally, you can focus them now. But I yapped a lot, so I don't think we're going to have enough time for the second half. Next up, you're going to have 3 enemies. You're going to have the Pyro Mage that spawns here, and then you're going to have the Dendrosamatro that spawns right in front of you, behind them. Depending on which Hydro or Electro units you have, you're going to want to approach this differently. If you don't have a great way of breaking their shields in AoE, you're going to want to quickly dash towards the Samaturl to prevent it from doing its Vines attack. Start attacking it and staggering it as soon as possible. And once it's dealt with, you can deal with either of the mages one at a time. If you have some good AoE, you can try to just AoE down everything, but you can also try to position yourself so that you're out of range from the left Pyro Abyss Mage, but in range of the right Pyro Abyss Mage. Like this. I fucked it up. It's like this. And then as soon as it starts the teleport animation, you start dashing towards this one. Fuck! I give up on showing this, man. I fucking hate the Samaturl. I took half of my fucking HP as damage over time from the Pyro bullshit. Yeah, also a little tip, if you are playing a Hyperloom team here, try not to use Nahida's E when they're shielded, because it doesn't help with your shield breaking, but it will make it so that they start burning and you will deal damage to yourself. Last wave, if they hit you while you have a shield, they disappear for like 1 second, but it's not the end of the world. You can kind of just mostly ignore that. At the beginning, you can stagger them, you can freeze them, you can crowd control them, whatever. So try to keep them grouped as well as possible. But once they fall down and then do their explosion as they shield up, they are not crowd controllable anymore, and you mostly can't move them. So once you get them relatively low HP, keep in the back of your mind, okay, once I get them to their shield phase, they will get staggered backwards, they'll fall down, and then they'll get back up, but still backwards. So you want to try to get them to fall onto one another, to stay close together. After that, they're gonna spawn their like weird pyro thingy on the ground. And again, when you break that, it is going to make them fall backwards again. So ideally, you want to get the pyro thingy to spawn close to them so that you can hit it and them at the same time. But as you're about to break it, remember, once I break this thing, this lector will fall backwards. So I'm going to want to try to dash to a position where if it goes backwards from me, right? If it falls back from me, because it's from your position, not from where the thing gets broken. If it falls back from me, it'll fall either onto the other one or onto where I'll also make the other one fall once I break its thing. And ideally you want to keep them grouped as well as possible so that maybe your application hits both of them more easily. Next up for Chamber 2, Genki now spawns closer to the center of the abyss than he used to back in the day. And what that means is that the ways you can manipulate its AI have changed. Previously, it spawned, instead of in the complete center, it spawned a little bit closer to one side, which meant that if you made a dash backwards, which is an attack that he pretty much always does after a certain amount of time, he would get stuck on the stairs and he wouldn't do the attacks where he dashes again for a pretty decent amount of time. That unfortunately is not possible anymore, but that doesn't mean there are no ways to prevent its movement. So at the beginning of Genki, right, everything is very straightforward. You just hit it until you get it to its second phase. Come on, there we go. So we're now getting to the second phase. And from here, if I'm attacking him, he has a 50-50 chance of going backwards and a 50-50 chance of doing this attack. After that, if he didn't go backwards, he's guaranteed to go backwards. But from here, if you go up to him and start attacking him, there's a chance he stays here or a chance that he goes forward like this and moves again. Which means he's going to start moving a lot. There are ways to control this, though. So, first off, I've found that he dashes backwards on the first attack a lot less often if you're just not hitting him as he decides to do his attack. But this one hasn't been that reliable for me. The most reliable way of preventing him from moving is this one. In between each of his attack, go back like this. As soon as he's deciding to what next attack to do, you go backwards. I didn't go backwards fast enough there. If you're not in his immediate melee range when he decides what attack to do, which is at a specific interval after each of his attacks is finished, he will not do the dash backwards attack. Right? That also means that if you're staying at a range the whole time, like you can with a character like maybe that, stabilize. Anyways. If you're staying far enough away from him, you'll be triggering his range attack pattern, which doesn't have the dash backwards or the like teleport forward attack. But it does have the dash forward attack like this, which means it's not gonna reliably get him to completely not move. In my experience, if you're weaving in and out of the melee range, it feels like he does the dash forward attack that I just showed less often, but I'm not entirely sure if that's just me being a f***ing idiot. Okay. Like, how does that f***ing hit me before I can dash out of it, huh? Like, you want to explain that to me? I think now he's gonna do the slam. Yeah. But yeah, after a few attacks, he is going to do the slam down attack again, so you don't have to dash backwards. Yeah, it's 30 seconds after the last slam, more or less. But because each attack takes a different amount of time, the exact timing for it is going to be slightly different. So it's about 30 seconds after the slam from the phase change. Next up, obviously as usual for the Kairagis, make sure you're trying to kill them at the same time. You don't want one of them to regen because you took too long to kill the other one. Try to split your damage around 50-50. I'm a fucking idiot. Okay, I don't want to talk about it. One thing I want you to keep in mind is if they are in the middle of an attack, they will not stop to regenerate. On top of that, their 1-hit combo attacks become 3-hit combo attacks once the other one dies. What that means is if you kill one of them as the other one is doing an attack animation, you actually have a pretty generous window to kill the other one. Okay. So we can show it here, right? It's gonna do the first hit, and then it's gonna do a second hit, and then it's gonna do a third hit. And you have all this very generous time window to kill it before it regenerates. Right, so timing your kills isn't necessarily about killing both of them exactly at the same time. It's also about killing them in the middle of attack patterns that are beneficial. As you saw in the first time I was trying to show this, if you kill one of them as the other one is completely idle, it's going to regenerate almost instantly. Then the Rift Hounds is just a matter of hitting them until they die. And same for the last chamber. For here, focus on the humanoid one, because the small one is very squishy, and the big one is gonna go towards you very, very quickly. Keep in mind, once it starts becoming Xiangling, you want to run away because Xiangling is very broken. And then you're done. If you have enough healing or damage reduction or whatever, you can phase tank through it, but do keep in mind it will stagger you if you don't have any form of resistance or interruption. Finally, we have Simon. I talk about these pretty much every time Simon is an Abyss, but we can quickly go over the non-Quicken tips for it, because with Quicken, it's very straightforward. Once it disappears, it will respawn up here, invisible. You apply Dendro and Electrode to it, trigger Quicken, and disable it. If you don't have Quicken, but you do have Electro, you apply Electro to the green little thingies, and it's gonna disable it. And then finally, if you don't have Electro whatsoever, this is what you do. So it starts, it opens up, you can do a rotation, get some damage in. But keep in mind, you want to keep a little bit of damage, right? You don't want to use up all of your damage before the things get spawned, because you need to be able to break these things. And these things are broken through damage. They have no elemental thing related to them whatsoever. You just break them with damage. But then on top of that, you cannot apply elements to them. That means that if you're looking at something like Kazuha Pyro Swirl, it's not going to do any f***ing damage, right? You want to do stuff that has strong motion value without relying on reactions. You're looking at Xiangling Burst, you're looking at normal attacks on Arlecchino, whatever, Navia E, anything like that. If you have enough front-loaded damage, you can also try to destroy these things before it goes invisible. And if you manage to do that, then it will not go invisible at all, and because here, as you can see, it has a lot of resistance, we're doing 2,000 damage instead of 20,000, being able to do that is going to be a pretty big deal. Now, Simon can, if your team isn't very well adapted to it, if you're relying on a lot on reaction damage, and you don't have Quicken, you can end up taking a decent amount of time on this chamber. If I stop yapping and actually just try to DPS it down with this team, you're gonna see it's not gonna be all that great. Oh my god, I got fucking... Oh, never mind. I managed to destroy the thingies before it turned invisible. That's actually great, because I get to show it. That was Omega clutch. But yeah, on its first attack, if it does the 2 spinny thingies, he goes invisible slower than the other attacks, which can give you a little bit more time to destroy the spinny thingies before he disappears. So that's another... Oh, f*** off. That's another thing you can keep in mind. During this invisibility phase, right, you want to make sure you set up all your things that can be set up, so that once the invisibility phase is over, you can DPS it down. Finally, last chamber, very traditional skirmishers. They dash away from you, so if you go towards them... No, I did not show that well, but I don't care. I'm not resetting. If you go towards them, you can make them dash away from you towards the other ones. Next up, you've got some Consecrated Beast. Focus the sea animals, not the consecrated. What is, oh my, I am, whatever. I should have Proto Ember on Nahida, but it's okay. Please don't die to my own hyper blooms. Begging. Fine.
Now you shall perish.
But yeah, for this chamber, there's honestly not much to say. Just don't die. Do your best. The seahorses are a bit scarier than the crabs. Their attacks are a little bit less telegraphed, but... Why did I swap to a 2 HP character when I was on a character that did not have 2 HP? I don't even know. It's fine, I'm still clearing in time, but... Who cares? This is not... I feel like there isn't anything to say about this, though. Again, right, target the sea animals, not the consecrated beasts. Maybe explain how to dodge the beasts. I mean, there's not much to explain. If you're melee range from them, they do a lot of attacks that have very hard to notice wind-up times. But if you're a little bit further away from them, pretty much everything is like a circle that progressively gets bigger until it reaches the edge, and then it deals damage once it reaches the edge. Right, it's very, very straightforward to dodge. Anyways, I'm gonna be honest, this Abyss is not really fun to do. Again, right, it's very restrictive on the second side, and I don't like when Abysses are restrictive in team building, because what I enjoy the most is team building. And when the restrictions is basically just, hey, most of your teams just won't work here, rip bozo, I guess, it kind of sucks. It makes it a lot less fun. And the DPS requirements are also really high, which makes worse teams a lot harder to make work than they usually are. But yeah, I don't think there's anything else I really need to mention. I mean, the Blessing gives you a little bit of normal attack damage. It's not that significant, but it is nice, I guess. That's gonna be it for this Abyss. Let's hope that Imaginarium Theater is gonna be more fun than this shit, because god. And you bet I will be making a video on Imaginarium Theater, the sort of teams that you can use in there, and how to maximize the use out of each character. So, as usual, I hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know if you have any feedback about the meta roundups. If you have any teams you think I should have mentioned that you think are doing particularly better than usual or particularly worse. And yeah, as usual, I hope you learned a thing or two, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.